Many years ago, one of my mentors said to me, I guess it was when I was about to have my first child, he said, never spoil your children. I'd heard that before. But he told me, he said, there's something in us that does want to spoil children, and especially grandchildren. He said, but don't do it. Don't give into it. And what he said was, I thought was really wise. His advice was, if you've got to spoil somebody, spoil your dog, spoil your cat. And here's why. It won't hurt them. And doesn't that make a lot of sense? And wouldn't you agree? Maybe not. I'll say this. It will not hurt them nearly as bad as it's going to hurt children to be spoiled. That we're talking today about a spoiled young man. See? A spoiled young man named Joseph, the favorite son of his father. His father gave him special treatment. And the reason his father gave him this special treatment is that this boy came from a special place. He was the oldest son of Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. Rachel was the wife he worked for an additional 7 years. She had died by now. And at this point, the closest thing he had to this woman who was the love of his life was the oldest child they'd had together, Joseph. And so it followed that all the boys Jacob had sired by these other women he had around him were like second-class citizens in the family, and that doesn't feel good to the second-class people. Joseph, on the other hand, was given a fancy coat of many colors that everybody seems to know about. And Joseph was going to find out what you'll find out, what I find out, what we see all around us. We're going to find out what happens when we give a person too much positive attention. It's possible to get too much. And I think in this generation more than any other before, we have more than ever, and we naturally give our kids more than ever. Not only material things, but also affirmation, flattery, building them up. After all, I want my kids to have a strong self-esteem. I really do. But make sure when you're talking to your kids, or just people in general, people you care about, point out the good things about them to be celebrated. But don't flatter them. Flattering someone is never a favor. You know what a good definition of flattery is? Flattery is saying something to someone's face that you'd never say behind their back. It's just the opposite of gossip, but it's also just as damaging. Because what happens when a person gets flattered or spoiled, every time somebody gives them unusually unhealthy special treatment, here's what happened. Their balloon gets a little bigger. Brag on them a little more. Show off their picture several more times. Get on Photoshop and make that bass your grandson caught look twice as big as he actually is. Tell everybody your granddaughter won the beauty pageant, and really she was honorable mention. Because they felt sorry for her. You know what you do? The more you blow up, and you know what I'm fixing to do, don't you? The more you blow up somebody's ego, the easier it is to pop. And the less it takes to pop try to pop a balloon with no air in it, or just a little bit of air, you really have to job it pretty good. You may have to even hold it still and stab it. But when it's full of air, when it's inflated, poof, the least little thing. And have you noticed that we live in a society where people get offended over the least little comments, and it becomes little comments that were not meant to do any damage, get blown up into big balloons that bust and make a whole lot of racket, because more and more we're full of ourselves, so full of ourselves that it doesn't take much to pop us. I at least hope that what I've just said is going to help you better appreciate the way this young man, Joseph, thought, the way he had been programmed by his father, the way his mind worked, the way he saw himself in relation to other people, all of that as described in Genesis 37. 37, 3 to 5. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it to his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. The first dream, let me describe quickly. It's that Joseph saw himself and his brothers in a field. He had the largest bundle of wheat. All the others had smaller bundles of wheat because they were underachievers, basically. And when he showed up with his big bundle of wheat, their bundles bowed down to his bundle. You might even say it this way: their accomplishments in life, their status was so inferior to his that they could do nothing but bow down. Now let me read you the second dream, which reinforced this. By the way, when you have repetitive dreams, the same dream over and over, it's usually because you're not getting the message the first time. And so it will come back repeating itself, the same basic idea, maybe using different characters and different images. And that's what you have here, because this one gets even more clear and shows us an even sharper perspective of the way Joseph's mind worked. This is chapter 37, verse 9 through 11. And he dreamed yet again, yet another dream, and told it to his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more. And behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him. You know it's getting out of hand when the father who spoiled him and flattered him in the first place has to say, cut it down a notch, Joseph. His father rebuked him. What is this that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come down to bow down ourselves to thee to the earth? And his brethren envied him. But his father observed the saying. Now that's worth a little bit of attention. His brothers envied him, and it's so obvious why they would have, that it requires no explanation. On the other hand, his father, who didn't especially like the idea of having to bow down to his own son, his father, how did it say that? His father observed the saying. His father, Israel, was a wise old man of God who'd seen a lot. And he had a lot of discernment. And he, too, sensed that there was something about this boy Joseph. And while he wasn't going to get as angry as the brothers, certainly would never have harmed his son, he decided to watch and wait and just see, what if this is some sort of prophecy? As many of you know, it really did turn out to be. It was a hint of Joseph's destiny. That Joseph started out very high in life. He got used to living high. He got used to being way up here, looking down on everybody else. And he expected to go from this level straight to the top. And I guess that sometimes happens among celebrities, athletes, singers, movie stars. They're golden boys and girls. They win all the pageants. They're all stars. The whole time they're growing up, and then they just keep going up and away. But they've never experienced what it's like to be a normal person. They have no idea what it really feels like to lose, to be on the bottom. And therefore, they're pretty condescending toward anybody who's not doing as well as they're doing. Well, if those folks aren't performing as well as I am, they're obviously just lazy, or they're not trying. Why don't they just do what I do? And of course, they don't realize it's because different people are made of different things for different reasons. And so the person who's never been on the bottom has no business being at the very top, because he will make a terrible ruler. No sympathy, no empathy, no real understanding of life, and especially of other human beings. And so, if God truly wanted to take this Joseph to the top, the way the dream revealed, before you could take him high, he was going to have to take him low. And that's exactly what happened. Look at the Bible, verse 37, verse 23. Joseph, wearing his coat, his fancy coat, was told to go out into the field where his brothers were working, taking care of the animals, the livestock. He wasn't sent out there to join them. He was sent out there to check on them and report back. Verse 23, and it came to pass when Joseph was come unto his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread. And they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And his brothers said, we've got him where we want him. We could kill him, but we've got an even better option here. We can have a win-win situation. We can get rid of him for good and get paid for it. So they sold him into slavery. Knowing these traders were headed for Egypt, where, by the way, Pharaoh was engaged in some of his largest building projects. It required hundreds of thousands of slave laborers. Slave laborers who were treated not even like animals. They were treated worse than animals. Animals, if you're going to really get the most out of a horse, a mule, any kind of work animal, you're going to have to take pretty good care of them because they're worth some money and they're not that easy to come by. You're going to feed them good. You're going to make sure there's plenty to drink. You're going to make sure they get to rest and that they're taken care of. You'd think it would be that way with slaves. And perhaps in some cases it has been, but not in Egypt. Because in Egypt, a world power who constantly fought wars on every front, winning every war they fought, they were taking in hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of captives. The defeated nations, that's where slaves came from. The people you defeated. And they were defeating and capturing more slaves than they knew what to do with. And you know what? How that goes. When supply goes up, the value goes down. These slaves were cheap. And it was much cheaper to simply work one to death and haul him off, throw him in the pit with the other bodies and bring in fresh bodies and work them until they die. After all, there's an endless supply. That's where Joseph was headed. It was a fate worse than death. In fact, it was death. It was certain death. Only it was going to be a slow, horrible death. And there was Joseph in that hole, helpless for the first time in his life. His father wasn't there. There was no sense of God's nearness either, no awareness of it, because as much as we're told, at this point in Joseph's life, he had not yet developed any kind of deep relationship with God. People who are riding high and arrogant generally do not develop surrendered, humble servants' hearts toward God or anybody else. In fact, that's one of the ways that you can recognize a true prophet from a false prophet. The false prophet or the false Christian will be and can be and often is extremely arrogant. Extremely arrogant. Very condescending toward other people. Very judgmental toward people who can't seem to get it together the way he or she has got it together. And yet, there's a scripture. I believe it's in Hebrews. It says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord. And he will lift you up. But in order to be lifted up, we must first humble ourselves. Joseph had no intention of doing that. And God, in his grace, I said in his grace and love, arranged it for Joseph to go from the highest place to the lowest place, the pit, and from there headed to slavery. And I can tell you this, though I don't know the details of it or how he may have processed it, I can tell you, something in Joseph died on the way down to Egypt. Something died. His balloon got busted for one thing. So did his pride. And after spending his entire life sneering, looking down at people on lower levels, he's down there not only with them, but beneath them. Something died in Joseph. It was something that needed to die in order for him to really live in an authentic relationship with God. A relationship with God where he was growing closer and closer to God day by day, where God was therefore touching people all around him through him. And God was even preparing him for things he'd never yet dreamed of. Something died and something new was born. And by the time he got to Egypt, much of his old mentality was already gone. But apparently God saw that Joseph was still hanging on to some of his vanity. After all, the Bible does tell us he was a good-looking young man. So good-looking that his master's wife laid eyes on him, made a play for him. Whether it was flattering or not, he did the right thing. He refused her. And what do they say? Hell has no fury like a woman scorned. She was scorned. She accused him of rape. He was thrown into prison. So he went from low to lower, from pit to dungeon. A hole, basically. A hole, which may or may not have had a lid on it. And there he spent 2 years. And there, in that prison, is where a whole lot of people would have ended whatever sort of relationship with God they may have started beforehand. Because, what do you expect the first thought was? When you consider yourself to be a person with good morals. I mean, just look, he turned down a chance at adultery. A 21-year-old boy, raging hormones, turned it down. Doing good stuff. He had good morals. And he'd never committed any of the big sins that get preached about. Oh, but what a prideful person he was. And down in that dungeon, things began to change. For the first time in his life, Joseph started getting interested in other people. And he noticed, after he had soaked in his own pain for a while, likely some self-pity. I'd have sure been pitying myself. Oh, how hard it must have been to have pulled himself out of self-pity. Because whatever he had done wrong, he didn't deserve that. And it looked like this God that he'd heard about, who supposedly had great things for him, had completely abandoned him. That's the place where many lose their faith. They conclude that there's no point to even go on living. Well, let me say something about that business of, is there a point to go on living? Was there a point for Joseph to go on living? Well, do you know the answer is it depends. And that's not a dodge of the question. That's a realistic answer to the question. Let me explain. If Joseph had remained in self-pity, if he had completely given up his faith in God, shriveled up, and died a cynical wretch, then guess what? All that suffering would have been pointless. But because he pulled himself up and reached up to God, then began reaching out to the people around him, other people who were unfortunate, other people like the butler and the baker, who also once had high positions and now were low. He related to the lowlifes now. And he loved them. They were real human beings. He loved them and he cared. And so when they were troubled over their dreams, he was their minister. What if he'd abandoned his faith, though? What if he'd just given up? Not only would it have been pointless, he would never have become the godly example and the godly leader that he eventually grew into. And in applying that to you and to me, I want to say this very clearly. You're going to have your time in the dungeons, in the pits, in the prisons, in places you are unhappy, in circumstances you want to change but can't. And that's where the future of your existence will be decided. That's where you will decide whether your life is going to be pointless or whether you're going to make it count. Recently I read a quote. I can't even remember where it came from. It ultimately came from God, for it is so true. The quote is this: when you find yourself against a wall, plant a tree. When you find yourself against a wall, there's no getting over it. There's no getting around it. You're just there. Do something constructive. Plant a tree. And then, therefore, if nothing else, once you're gone, once you're dead, or once you somehow get away, you will have left something useful and beautiful behind. And guess what else? If God sees fit to keep you behind that wall for longer than you expected or wanted to be there, perhaps because you are resisting the lesson instead of cooperating with it. By the way, the longer you resist the lessons, the more they have to be repeated. The quickest way out is to go ahead and humble yourself, open up, look up, and hang on. But when you plant that tree, it's going to grow. It's going to grow to the point where the next person who comes along and finds themselves against that same wall with no way out is going to find a different situation than the one you found, because there's a tree there, a tall tree with limbs that go high and wide, limbs that come down on this side of the wall, limbs that drop over on the other side of the wall, limbs that give somebody in the future an opportunity to climb up and out. Joseph planted a tree when he invested his life in this butler and baker who were so troubled over their dreams because, though it was a full 2 years later, you know, time's relative. It flies when you're having fun. It drags when you're hurting and miserable. 2 years is a long time. It can seem like a lifetime in a place like Joseph was in. But 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed a dream. The butler and the baker, no, it was the butler who remembered Joseph. Joseph was brought up. Let's read this together. Genesis 41. Genesis 41, verse 1, verse 8, and verse 14. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years, Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by a river. Verse 8. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. And that's when the butler remembered and reminded. Verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And that day was the hinge on which his whole world turned. And the next thing you know, old Joe was a millionaire. Next thing you know, Joseph was on high once again, second highest in command, over the greatest superpower of that time. Joseph had started a self-deluded big shot, had to be taken several yards beneath the earth, way down. Thomas Merton wrote the lines, I went all the way down, down, all the way down. Nobody ever went down so far as me. But then he speaks of how God brought him up. And I came up and rang my bell. Joseph had a bell to ring. He had something to celebrate. He had lived a truth that is in this moment being passed on to people he knew nothing of. He experienced life and experienced God and cooperated and surrendered in such a way that he helped more people than he ever lived to see. And how did it happen? How did he get to that point? It's because during that moment, at his lowest, when he wanted to give up, he instead chose to look up and begin climbing. May that be your choice. Don't fight with God. Don't give up on God. Simply surrender and demonstrate your faith by waiting and then follow him out into what future he creates for you.